We'll start with the lecture. This is where we had stopped last time. Now this table is extremely important for setting MCQs. These are the sites where the portal vein and the systemic vein communicate with each other. So pressure rise in the portal vein will cause a backflow of blood into the systemic vein. So at the esophagus, the left gastric vein draining the lower one third of esophagus, lower part of esophagus, communicates with the zygous vein draining the upper part of the lower one third. When this portal pressure rises, this anastomosis enlarges in size. It's called as esophageal varices. Commonly occurs in people who are alcoholics, esophageal varices. And when this varices bleeds, it goes into the stomach and the person vomits out a coffee brown colored blood because acidic action on the hemoglobin causes acid hematine. And the quantity of blood vomited could be quite large. So the person can either go into shock or even die because of the excessive bleeding. At the anal canal, not at the rectum, at the anal canal, the superior rectal artery, which is a branch of inferior mesenteric, the superior rectal vein drains into the portal vein. The middle and inferior rectal arteries are branches of the internal iliacs. So the middle and inferior rectal will drain into inferior vena cava. The communication between the two results in hemorrhoids. We had discussed in the previous class that there are two types of hemorrhoids, external hemorrhoids and internal hemorrhoids. External hemorrhoids are painful, but that is not a portosystemic anastomosis. The internal hemorrhoids are between superior rectal vein with the middle and inferior rectal veins. The painless hemorrhoids are the sign of portosystemic anastomosis. The anastomosis is between the vein draining above the pectinate line of anal canal with the vein draining below the pectinate canal. Hemorrhoids are often unrelated to portal vein pressure. So hemorrhoids can occur even in people who are eating less fiber diet, then these communication will enlarge. Whereas esophageal varices is classically when the portal pressure rises in alcoholics. In umbilicus, the paraumbilical vein, a tributary of communicates with the superficial epigastric vein, a tributary of great saphenous branch of femoral. These communicate at the umbilicus. In a fair-skinned individual, when this communication occurs, you will see the dilated veins around the umbilicus radiating away from the umbilicus. That is called as caput medusae. Caput means the head. Medusa is a Greek demon who has got serpents, snakes, or as the hair present on the head of the Medusa demon. So the vessels dilating away from the umbilicus looks like snakes which are coming out from the head of the Medusa. The right and the left following the duodenal and pancreatic veins, all of which are GI tract and GI organs, will drain into portal system. Because the retroperitoneal organ, the body wall, renal, suprarenal, paravertebral, gonadal, and upper. The region which is not covered by peritoneum, those areas will anastomose as porta system. Within the liver also, there is a left branch of portal vein which communicates with the inferior vena cava directly as ductus venosus in the fetus. After birth, the umbilical vein collapses, ductus venosus also collapses. Sometimes the ductus venosus remains patent. That is called as patent ductus venosus. Where this patent ductus arteriosus which is the communication between the left branch of pulmonary artery with the aorta. This is left branch of portal vein with the inferior aorta. That's why it's called as ductus venosus. The bare area of the liver, the diaphragmatic vein, this is in direct contact with the liver now because of the bare area. And of course, liver itself has got portal vein. There may be a communication between these two. So these 6 sites are important, and you can be asked the combination of any of these, that what is the vein, what is the portal tributary at the umbilicus. The options can be various things. Para-umbilical is the portal tributary, superficial epigastric in the system. Clinical condition of the retroperitoneal and bare area of the liver are not described as anything. The next topic that we are discussing is spleen. There's something called a Harris dictum in spleen, which is a formula of odd numbers. The spleen is 1 inch thick, that is 2.5 centimeters, 3 inches broad, with 7.5 centimeters, 5 inches long, that is 12.5 centimeters, weighs 7 ounces in weight. 1 ounce is approximately 28 grams. So 7 ounces means around 200 grams. And lies between the 9th and the 11th rib. So 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. 1 inch thick, 3 inches broad, 5 inches long, 7 ounces in weight, and lying between the 9th and the 11th rib. The visceral surface of the spleen has got a deep impression, which is for the stomach, has got a relatively shallow impression, which is for the kidney, left kidney, and it's got a much smaller impression for the flexure of the colon, left flexure, and at the hilum, there is a relation of tail of pancreas. Now you can also see the splenic artery dividing into multiple branches, but even before it enters the spleen, it gives a gastric, short gastric 4 to 6, and 1 gastroepiploic branch. When the spleen is ruptured, don't try to repair the rupture. What you try to do is you remove the spleen altogether. When you are removing the spleen, you have to ligate the vessels which are entering the spleen. But after the gastric branches and gastroepiploic branches are given off. So you have to be as close to the spleen as possible. And also you have to take care that you should not clamp the tail of the pancreas. The tail of the pancreas is related to the hilum. If you go very close to the spleen, you are not going to like it. If you ligate the tail of the pancreas, what happens is the tail of pancreas has got maximum islets of Langerhans. So you are also damaging a lot of islets. That can result in postoperative diabetes mellitus, which is also called as iatrogenic diabetes mellitus. Iatro is another word for doctor. The doctor has generated the diabetes mellitus, iatrogenic diabetes. You are feeling the notches of you can feel an enlarged spleen for the notches, but notches are not a constant feature. Notches are usually present along the anterior border or superior border, but it may be present elsewhere also. The notches only signify that spleen is made for fusion of multiple nodules and the larger superior surface. The nodules may not completely fuse, resulting in notches, but then, as you said, it's not a constant feature. Spleen is 200 grams in weight, we said. Only when it enlarges 2.5 times, when it becomes 500 grams, then only the spleen is palpable in the abdomen. Otherwise, it's a small organ related to the ribs that you can't palpate a normal spleen. When the spleen enlarges to 5 times this weight, that is 1000 grams, the spleen will reach up to the umbilicus. And when it is 1,500 grams, commonly seen in multiple attacks of malaria, the spleen will be 1,500 grams, in which case it will reach the right iliac fossa, not the left. The reason for this is that spleen is supported below by the phrenico-colic ligament. This phrenico-colic ligament goes from the left colic flexure to the diaphragm below the spleen. So spleen can't descend vertically down because of the support phrenico-colic ligament. So it directs itself downwards towards the right. Also, because spleen is a supracolic structure, when it descends down, it descends above the root of the mesentery. The root of the mesentery is extending from left superior to right inferior. Spleen will descend down along the root of the mesentery, above the root of the mesentery, to go to the right iliac fossa. So whether you are palpating enlarged liver or enlarged spleen, you always start from the right iliac fossa. And then if you are palpating the spleen, you proceed upwards toward the left. If you are palpating the liver, attempting to palpate the liver, you have to traverse with the right iliac fossa vertically upwards. Accessory spleens are seen near the hilum of the spleen. This is incomplete fusion of the splenic nodules present at the tail of the pancreas, a little away from the hilum. The mesentery of the spleen, the gastrosplenic ligament, the omentum, the territory of the stomach, the small bowel mesentery, the ovary, the testes. These are the sites where accessory spleens could be seen. We already discussed splenomegaly and movements with the respiration. So in inspiration, the spleen will move downwards and towards the right. The phrenico-colic ligament you will see here, which is supporting the spleen, not allowing the spleen to vertically descend down. When you attempt to clamp the splenic vessels, you will also clamp the tail of the pancreas, which gives rise to iatrogenic diabetes mellitus. Sir William Osler described the relation of the duodenum with the head of the pancreas as the romance of the abdomen. Where he says, the head of the pancreas lies folded in the arms of the duodenum. Next topic that we discuss is the kidney. The posterolateral approach of the kidney is advantageous because of the fact that you don't enter the peritoneal cavity. You are approaching the spleen from behind. But people also do an anterior approach to the kidney. But what you are expected as a undergraduate student is that in the posterolateral approach of the kidney, what are the structures that are cut? Of course, besides the skin and the superficial fascia, the deep fascia, but you are also cutting in sequence. Latissimus dorsi, serratus posterior inferior, external oblique is split along the fiber, internal oblique transverse abdominis, peritoneum is pushed forwards, pleura is pushed upwards, renal, facial, and capsule are incised, then the kidney is taken out. The point to be remembered is that you are taking an incision below the 12th rib, below the 12th rib. Because up to the level of 12th rib, the posterior scapular line, the pleura extends up to the 12th rib. So you don't want to accidentally cut the pleura and cause a air entry into the pleura which can collapse the lungs. So what you are doing is you have to feel the 12th rib. Sometimes the 12th rib may be absent, and you may wrongly think that the 11th rib is the 12th. And then you have cut the pleura. Because pleura will go up to the level of 12th rib. Sometimes there is an additional limb, lumbar rib. You may feel that is the 12th rib, and you may go below it, and you may miss the kidney altogether. So for counting the ribs, you must always count from the sternal angle. The sternal angle is opposite the second costal cartilage. Proceed downwards and backwards till you palpate each intercostal space and the rib in between, and confirm that the rib that you are feeling is the 12th rib. If you can't feel the 12th rib, you can feel only up to the 11th. Go 1 inch below that. So that that is the position of the 12th rib. That is the position of the pleura. When the kidney becomes hypermobile, it results in drop of the kidney. Remember, the word ptosis refers to drooping of the upper eyelid. Actually, the ptosis just means drooping. When the kidney droops, it is called nephroptosis. So people in ptosis, P is not pronounced, but in nephroptosis, you can also pronounce it as nephroptosis. Hypermobility of the kidney. What happens is the blood or the pus moves downward into the pelvis. Kidney will also move downward into the pelvis. Midline attachment of renal fascia close to the midline of the two kidneys, fused with the tunica adventitia of the great vessels, the aorta and the inferior vena cava. So kidney, when it's mobile, can't move medially or to the opposite side. There is a common Gerota's fascia which splits to enclose the kidney, so it can't move laterally. There is a fascia which is separating it from the suprarenal gland and diaphragm above it. It can't move superiorly. So the only place where nephroptosis can occur is downward, drooping down. Even the pus and the blood collection will droop down into the pelvis. The kidney can also go down. Nephroptosis stretches the renal vessels. That's why the dull pain is seen because of overstretching of the renal vessels. We already discussed this, that the main renal artery will pass behind the inferior vena. Remember, this diagram is seen from the post. This diagram is incorrect. The main renal artery, which is going to the hilum, will pass behind the inferior vena. The accessory renal artery, which is below IVC, will pass in front, and accessory renal IVC going above, and the middle suprarenal artery will, and the inferior suprarenal artery will pass behind IVC. So this diagram is incorrect. Only this one which passes in front of IVC is correct. These vessels should pass behind IVC. The kidneys develop in the pelvis. As they ascend upwards, they come close to the bifurcation of the aorta. And then they move further laterally. So first they start off laterally in the pelvis, come close to the midline, then proceed again laterally. While they are proceeding laterally, often the lower poles of the two kidney fuse. Often means the variation. In such a case, the kidney results in a horseshoe. And the horseshoe kidney, when it ascends, it can ascend only up to the inferior mesenteric artery. So inferior mesenteric artery, which is the midline, will not allow the kidney to further ascend. So such a horseshoe kidney will always be low placed with the hilum at L3 level where the inferior mesenteric artery. Also, the kidney, when it ascends upwards, its hilum originally is forwards. Then when it reaches the lumbar region, the hilum turns medially. Here, because of the fusion of the horseshoe, the hilum continues to lie anteriorly. It can't turn because of the horseshoe nature. Automatically, the ureter which is coming to the hilum will be more anteriorly placed. Remember, in the pelvis, the hilum was anterior. because the ureter was entering the urinary bladder, which is the most anterior structure in the pelvis. It's only after it reaches the lumbar region that the kidney turns its position. In a horseshoe, ureters will always lie in front of the urethra. When it comes to a renal transplant, we said that the right renal vein is extremely short. So only a skillful surgeon can use the right kidney. Otherwise, left kidney is safer. Obviously, when you are doing a live renal transplant, that is, the donor is alive and is giving a kidney to his relative, in such a case, you should always take the lesser functioning kidney for the recipient. The donor always retains his better functioning kidney. Also, the point to be noted is that the kidney, when it is transplanted, you don't transplant it in the lumbar region itself. You transplant it in the pelvis. So the kidney is taken, whichever left or right, is taken to the pelvis, where the renal artery is anastomosed with internal iliac artery. The renal vein is transplanted to the internal iliac vein, and the ureter is directly connected to the urinary bladder, which lies in the pelvis. We will say if your internal iliac artery is taken to the kidney, what will happen to the pelvic organs? The other internal iliac artery is sufficient to perfuse the entire pelvis. Sometimes you can also do, if you are skillful, and add two side anastomosis. If you don't connect the internal iliac mouth to mouth anastomosis, you connect the sides of the internal iliac with the renal artery. Another point to be noted is that the bladder is anterior. So ureters must be anterior. But we know in the kidney, the renal vein is most anterior, then the artery and the ureter is most posterior. Whereas here in the pelvic kidney, when you are placing it in the transplant, you want the ureter to be anterior. How can you do that? What you can do is, if you are taking the left kidney, place it in the right pelvis. If you are taking the right kidney, place it in the left side of the pelvis. So what happens is you are turning the kidney. The posterior relation becomes the anterior relation. You are turning the kidney and placing it in the pelvis. But what you are doing is you are flipping the kidney horizontally and placing it that side of the pelvis. Automatically, ureter are most anterior. It can be easily anastomosed with the bladder. And the renal artery, the renal vein. The renal vein will now become most posterior. Incidentally, internal iliac vein is also more posterior. So we can anastomose the internal iliac with the renal vein and the internal iliac artery with the renal artery. So remember, right kidney is placed in the left half of pelvis, left kidney is placed in the right half of pelvis. Posterior abdominal wall, we have already discussed that the broad ligament passes from the anterior surface of the uterus, passes above the fallopian tube, from fallopian tube to ovary called as mesosalpinx, from the posterior layer of broad ligament to the ovary by the mesovarium, and you know that it's called as mesometrium, part of the uterus, part of the salpinx, part of the ovary. Posteriorly, you can see the peritoneum very close to the posterior surface, including the upper surface of the vagina. Anteriorly, there is a segment of the uterus left below. It is called as the lower segment. So when you are operating and cutting lower segment, you cut only the isthmus portion of the uterus during cesarean section. Also, the uterine artery and the relation of ureter, care has to be taken that the ureter is not cut. What you have to do is, before you clamp the uterine artery, which as sir, you can might clamp both of them together. Before you clamp the uterine artery, identify the ureter push it laterally, and then clamp the uterine artery close to the uterine body as possible. The blood supply of the ureter is interesting. The abdominal part of ureter lies close to the aorta, so it gets direct branches from the aorta from the medial side. The pelvic part of the ureter gets the blood supply from internal iliac artery, which lies lateral to the ureter. There is no single artery to ureter. It's a multiple small branches which supply the ureter. So unnamed branches supply the abdominal ureter from the aorta. Unnamed branches from the pelvic part of ureter is supplied by internal iliac artery. The aorta supplies the ureter from the medial side. The internal iliac supplies the ureter from the lateral side. So when you are pushing the ureter, make sure that the abdominal ureter is pushed medially, because if you want to operate in the region behind the ureter, abdominal ureter should be pushed medially because the blood vessels come from medial side. If you push it laterally, you might rupture the vessels supplying the ureter. Pelvic ureter should always be pushed laterally, mobilized laterally, because the blood supply comes from the lateral side. That's about ureter. When you have to mobilize the ureter and push it, you should push it into the towards the aorta in the abdomen, towards the internal iliac in the pelvis. Constrictions of the ureter. One is at the beginning of ureter, that's called as pelviureteral junction. Second is exactly when the ureter passes in front of sacroiliac joint, that is midway through the ureter, and one is at the terminal part of ureter, where the ureter enters the bladder. That is called as uterovesical junction. So pelviureteral junction, exactly midline and terminal part. Calculus, the stone, will often get stuck at these 3 points: pelviureteral junction, midway through, and at the uterovesical junction. But also a fourth site is there where the ureter, where the stone can get stuck. In the pelvic part of ureter, vertical sacroiliac joint, ureter vertically descends down up to the ischial spine. Pelvic part. Abdominal also vertically descends down, pelvic also vertically descends. At the ischial spine, the ureter takes a sharp right angle turn and then passes anteriorly. So at that point, at the ischial spine, because of the sharp bend, the stone may get stuck there also, which is not a constriction, but because of the change in the direction of the ureter, the stones are likely to get lodged there. So these are the sites where you will search for the stones. Sometimes arising from one kidney is double ureter. Because of the developmental nature of the ureter and the mesonephric duct which gets absorbed into the trigone of the bladder, whenever there is double ureter, the ureter draining the upper part of the kidney will open into the bladder at a lower level. And those draining the lower half of kidney will drain at the upper level, at the side where the ureter normally opens, upper corner of the trigone. So that is a point which should be noted. Whenever there is a double ureter, those draining the upper kidney will open at the side in the region of the trigone, but at a level lower than what the normal ureter opens. Uterine artery, water under the bridge, uterine ureter in relation to rectus deferens and vas efferens. Vas efferens will cross above the ureter, water under the bridge. Lumbar plexus, we already discussed this, but only the point to be remembered is that the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve will go to the anterior superior iliac spine, will get trapped there and can result in altered sensorium the lateral part of the thigh, called as viralgia parasitica. Sometimes there is an accessory obturative valve. This is in close relation to the obturative valve. This, if it is present, will supply the pectineus muscle. So if you get an MCQ, pectineus is supplied by option A, femoral nerve, option B, obturative nerve, option C, both the nerves, option D, none of the nerves. All four answers are correct because in some individuals, pectineus is supplied by femoral, in some individuals, pectineus is supplied by obturator, in some individuals, pectineus is supplied by both, in some individuals, whoever have accessory obturator will neither femoral nor obturator will supply, the accessory obturator will supply. But remember, obturator nerve passes through obturator foramen. Accessory obturator nerve will not pass through obturator foramen. It will accompany the femoral nerve and then enter the thigh in front of the pubic ramus, superior ramus of pubis, and supply the pectineus. That's why there are some authors who prefer to call accessory obturator as accessory femoral nerve because it accompanies the femoral nerve. But then, since it's a branch in the anterior division, it is better called as accessory obturator. In lumbar sympathectomy, you have to make sure that the L1 ganglion is spared. L1 ganglion is for the ejaculation. So in a sympathectomy, you have to make sure that the ejaculatory fibers should not be damaged. Urinary bladder, interureteric bar of Mercier. The ureters are described to be entering the urinary bladder 2 inches apart, it is 5 centimeters apart. But the internal opening of the ureter is connected by a horizontal ridge, which is called as interureteric bar of Mercier. Interureteric bar of Mercier is only 1 inch in breadth, that is 2.5 centimeters. So the external opening of ureter is 5 centimeters apart. The internal opening of ureter is only 2.5 centimeters apart, which means that each ureter has passed through the musculature of the bladder obliquely, and therefore, when the bladder contracts, that oblique fibers also contract. And that's why urine will pass out to the urethra instead of going backwards towards the ureter. Because the contraction of the detrusor muscle also constricts the opening of the ureter. When you want to do a retrograde pylography, that means you want to study the urinary system, but the kidneys are non-functional. And you want to study the urinary system retrograde. You pass a catheter through the urethra and into the urinary bladder, then pass the catheter into any one of the bladders that you desire to study, or one at a time. Pass the catheter to the ureteric opening, into the ureter, and then inject the dye, radioactive dye, backward in the retrograde bladder. That's what retrograde pylography. When you are entering the bladder is not a problem, but searching for the ureteric opening is a big problem. So that's why you use an interureteric bar of Mercier, which is the horizontal ridge seen in the posterior part of the bladder. That is easy to identify. And then you can search for the opening at the edge of the Mercier's bar, which is where the ureter will look. The musculation of the bladder, the nerve supply to the muscles of the bladder and the bladder neck is important. The sympathetic and parasympathetic system supply the bladder. The parasympathetic is from S234, which has got the ganglion in the wall of the bladder, causes contraction of the detrusor muscle. The same one relaxes the internal sphincter. The sympathetic system, which is relaying in the inferior hypogastric, flexes the ganglia within that, and through that they go and supply the bladder and the bladder neck. So it relaxes the detrusor muscle and causes contraction of the sphincter. The external sphincter, which is striated, is supplied by S234, that is to the pudendal nerve. This was to the pelvic sphincter, and this is to the inferior epigastric plexus. Damage to any one of these will result in a condition which is called as neurogenic bladder. The highest controlling center of the bladder is medial frontal cortex, whose damage bilaterally will cause uninhibited bladder. The second line of control is at the pons close to the midline, paramedian pontine reticular formation, whose damage will result in the spinal reflexes intact, resulting in what is called as automatic bladder. And if the autonomic fibers are damaged, it will result, or if S234 is damaged, it will result in autonomic bladder. And an autonomic bladder is also called as atonic bladder, and the bladder enlarges in size to such an extent that there will be some amount of overflow fluctuation. Sensory fibers are primarily carried by parasympathetic, but are also carried by sympathetic. This tells us the nature of fullness of the bladder. Pudendal nerves are somatic, but as we said, striated muscles undergo fatigue relatively faster. But luckily, the external sphincter of the striated muscle will have slow twitch muscle fiber, which reasonably has got control over the urethral sphincter, which will stop the urine from flowing till the circumstances are better. The transverse section of the penile urethra will show the urethra horizontally disposed, but the external urethral orifice in males is a vertical slit. So, penile urethra is transverse slit, where external urethral orifice is vertically slit. So, from the glans penis, the horizontally displaced urethra will become vertical, which results in the male urine coming out in a spiral manner. So, spiralization of the flow of urine is the difference between male urination and female urination. Spiralization will occur in the male urine, so that the urine is passed far away from the lower limbs. Males being hunters, primitive males being hunters, they had to pass urine wherever in the forest in a standing position, because you can't crouch down and let the predators attack you. So the nature of the urinary system is such that in the males the urine will come out in a spiral manner. The narrowest part of the urethra is the external urethral orifice. The second narrowest part is the membranous urethra, that is lying in the deep pouch. At the junction between the glans penis and the body of penis, what is called as, there is a large portion of the urethra, which is called as lacuna magna or navicular fossa. This is present at the junction between glans penis and body of penis, which is called as corona glandis. The most dilatable part of the male urethra is what is in the prostate, the prostatic urethra. The narrowest part is external urethral orifice, but the second narrowest part is the membranous urethra. Lacuna magna is a dilated portion at the corona glandis, but the most distensible part of the urethra is prostate. So care has to be taken when you pass the urethra, catheter into the urethra, that you don't try to force the catheter through the lacuna magna in the diaphragm, in which case it will cause urethral rupture. So make sure that when you are passing the catheter, it has the penis has to be raised up so that the navicular fossa goes down, and therefore the catheter can easily pass. And extreme care has to be taken when it has reached, what do we say, around 10 to 12 centimeters after the catheter has passed, it will reach the navicular, it will reach the venous urethra. It's a pretty narrow part of the urethra, but you don't have to really bother much, because if the catheter has passed through the external urethral orifice, which is the smallest part, it is likely to pass if care is taken through the membranous urethra. Rupture urethra and extravasation of urine we already discussed. If the urethra ruptures above the perineal membrane, the urine will extravasate in the pelvis around the prostate. If the urethral rupture occurs in the superficial perineal pouch, that is superficial to perineal membrane, it will extravasate, but not going to the gluteal, it will go to the scrotum, anteroabdominal wall, and 1 centimeter down into the thigh. The plane of urine extravasation will be deeper to the cholecyst layer, which is a continuation of the abdominal scar prostate. Prostate and the capsules. This is what there is a lot of debate between anatomists and surgeons. They say, what have you been taught in anatomy? We always discuss in anatomy, and there is a true capsule of the prostate outside the prostate. Then we are outside the true capsule is the presence of prostatic venous plexus, and further outside that is the prostatic fascia, which is called as false capsule. Then we say that the venous plexus lies between the true capsule and the outside false capsule. To the surgeons, the outside capsule is always called as prostatic fascia. They don't call it as false capsule. They call it as prostatic fascia. The true capsule of the prostate is called as true capsule of the prostate, both by anatomists and surgeons. To the surgeons, when there is benign enlargement of prostate, as the median lobe gets enlarged, the outer glandular part of the urethra gets compressed. The outer glandular part of the urethra, when it gets compressed, that to the surgeons is a false capsule. It looks like a capsule, it's a false capsule. So to the surgeons, false capsule is inside, then is covered by true capsule, then is the venous plexus, then is the prostatic fascia. So when you say to a surgeon that the venous plexus lies between the true and the false capsule, they say, this is what you have been taught in anatomy. They want the answer. Prostatic venous plexus is outside the true capsule, but within the prostatic fascia. Because to them, the false capsule is the glandular portion of prostatic urethra when there is benign enlargement of prostate, which now becomes flattened. When the benign enlargement of prostate occurs, the median lobe of prostate enlarges against an unyielding true capsule, resulting in the glandular portion becoming resembling a capsule, which is the false capsule. The median lobe, when it is enlarged, it also enters within the urinary bladder, part of it. So when the urinary bladder goes into contraction, detrusor goes into contraction, it also presses upon the median lobe. And because the median lobe is pressed upon, the urine can't flow out because that will obstruct the urethra itself. So contraction of detrusor in a slightly enlarged median lobe will always have some residual urine in the bladder, because the terminal part of the urine cannot flow out because the Intrusion, the stronger the intrusion goes into contraction, the more will be the obstruction of the urethra because the enlarged median lobe which has entered the bladder. So what has to be done is that for extravasation, for the accumulated urine in the urinary bladder, what you need to do is to relax the detrusor. You relax the detrusor, it will cause the median lobe also to be stretched out. That will result in the urethra opening and the extravasated urine will gravitate out when you relax the urinary bladder. Hormonal influence and therefore the treatment of enlargement of prostate. Benign enlargement of prostate of the median lobe often is caused between the age of 40 to 60 when the testosterone level drops. A drop in testosterone level causes the median lobe to enlarge. Whereas at the age of 65 plus, sometimes in some individuals, the testosterone erratically rises. In which case, the glandular motion, the true glands of the prostate enlarges. This enlarges often outwards, not inwards. So it will not compress the bladder. It will spread into the pelvis, the vertebrae, and from the vertebral venous plexus can even reach the brain. This is prostatic carcinoma. Prostatic carcinoma is often caused by a rise in testosterone. So, and often the prostatic carcinoma is not detected till it is very late because it does not compress the urethra. So often beyond, if it is the metastasis that occur to the vertebral column and the brain, you can't really do anything with a surgery of prostate. It's an inoperable case. In such a case, and especially in an elderly individual who cannot tolerate a big surgery, what is often done is that you give anti-testosterone drugs like estrogen to the person. This will slow down the growth of the prostatic carcinoma. So it's the effect of erratic increase in testosterone that causes the prostatic glands to hypertrophy and turn carcinomatous and metastasize. So we already said, Batchen's plexus, another name for vertebral venous plexus, causes the spread of cancer from the prostate to the vertebral column and from there to the brain. We already discussed the rupture of urethra. The urethra rupture in the superficial form. It can go up to but not into the inner triangle, fill up the scrotum, fill up to some extent the penis because the buccal fissure is unyielding, and also go into the subscarpal layer in the anterior wall. This is what we said about the prostate enlarging, prostatic cancers, the hormonal methods. We already discussed the rectum urethra. Now, House's valve, we said, speculate line, the true junction between the endoderm and the ectoderm. Anal fissure, ischial abscess, perianal abscess. Fissures are rupture in the laminal abscesses because the blood supply is poor. Internal hemorrhoids in the lithotomy position will be seen at the left side transversely, that is 3 o'clock position. On the right side, there are two venous plexus. At 7 o'clock position, that is lower right, and 11 o'clock position, that is upper right. Patient's right. External hemorrhoid will be painful. Anal continence, we discuss about the sphincters of the anus, external sphincter, internal sphincter, corrugator cuticuli, and the puborectalis. This is very interesting. In tuberculosis of small intestine, the lymphatics are located transversely. So tuberculosis inflammation will pass through the lymphatics, will cause a constriction of the lymphatics and also therefore constriction of the small intestine. Whereas typhoid ulcerations are located along the pair spaces. So typhoid ulcerations are longitudinal. They will not obstruct the small intestine. Tuberculosis will obstruct the small intestine because they are along the lymphatic which are oriented transverse. So obstruction of the small intestine is possible in tuberculosis inflammation, not possible in typhoid. Why is this discussed with rectum and anal canal? In anal canal and the rectum, the vessels lie vertically along the long axis of the rectum. The arteries are longitudinal, veins are longitudinal, the lymphatics are also longitudinal. So tuberculosis of rectum and anal canal will travel along the lymphatics which are longitudinally oriented. And therefore, tuberculosis of rectum and anal canal will never ever obstruct rectum and anal canal as it was affecting the small intestine. So where the lymphatics were oriented transverse. Rectum has three curvatures, the upper and the lower are convex to the right, middle is convex to the left. In the mucosal aspect, you see the outside valves like this. Part of the rectum that lies below the middle valve is known as the ampulla of the rectum. Ampulla of the rectum is the original cloaca, and the part of the rectum above the middle valve is the original hindgut. So hindgut terminates at cloaca. If you are asked precisely, the junction between hindgut and cloaca is the middle valve of Hauser, the most prominent valve of Hauser. Ampulla is of the cloaca. Spaces in relation to the rectum and anal canal. The space between the levator and the rectum one is called as pelvirectal space. The space on the sides of the anal sphincters two is called as the ischio-anal space, which is often wrongly called as ischiorectal space. The space 3, which lies between the levator muscle and the superficial and deep sphincter, that is called as the intersphincteric spaces. Subcutaneous space is where the longitudinal muscle cord of the rectum passes through the subcutaneous sphincter, which causes corrugate cutis ani. There is 5, central space, that is the space which is the intersphincteric line of Hilton, and the submucous space which is lying between the circular muscle cord and the mucosa. So these spaces are the spaces where infection can arise, then spread accordingly, and the treatment also varies as per where the space is located and where does it open in the exterior. So the pectinate line and the Hilton's white line in the pectinate. The embryonic origin of the above the line is endoderm, below the pectinate line is endoderm. Above the pectinate line, the lining is in simple column. Below the pectinate line, it is sediment squamous. This is same as the sediment squamous of the external skin. The blood supply is through the rectal artery and the venous drainage is through the portal above the pectinate line. Systemic by way of inferior rectal vein and to some extent middle rectal vein. Above the pelvic pectinate line, the lymphatics go to the pelvic and the lumbar lymph nodes, and below the pectinate line, because it's a part of the perineum, it is going into the equinal lymph nodes. The medial part of the equinal lymph nodes drain the perineum, superficial equinal. The nerve supply above pectinate line is autonomic fibers, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Below, the external sphincters are supplied by inferior rectal nerve, a branch of pudendal nerve. The sensation quickly diminishes above the midpoint line. Here it's extremely well felt. That's why hemorrhoids below the midpoint line are also painful. Adenocarcinoma is a cancerous change above the midpoint line. It's a gland which is enlarged. Squamous cell carcinoma to the lining is squamous. It's a pathology below midpoint. So these are below midpoint line. They are above midpoint line. We already discussed typhoid versus tuberculosis. The rectum anal canal, you will see that the plexus are all longitudinal. So typhoid also cannot obstruct the lymphatics of the rectum canal to upwards or outwards. The pectinate line is the junction. In the per rectal examination in males, anteriorly, you will feel the bladder submucous urethra. In the females, you will feel anteriorly from the per rectal examination. Pouch of Douglas uterus cervix posterior gland. Laterally, in the male, you will feel the lateral ligaments, middle rectal artery, obturator transversal, side wall of pelvis, plexus, levator and eye. Same is the relation in the lateral wall of pelvis in males and females both. Posteriorly also, sacrum coccyx facial condensation superior rectal artery, sacrum and coccyx facial condensation superior rectal artery. So, and of course, there is a space behind the rectum. So all those are felt posteriorly. So we realize in a per rectal examination, in males and females, the lateral and posterior wall is the same. Only the anterior there is a difference. Usually, in females, you do a per vaginal examination. So whatever are seen anterior to rectum, in a per rectal vaginal examination, structures behind the rectum can be palpated in the posterior vaginal examination. And of course, uterus and cervix can be through an intravaginal examination. In males, the prostatic enlargement is often detected by per rectal examination and feeling anterior. Discuss about the four supports of the uterus. If the uterus is retrograde, retroflex, the chances of it her prolapsing out to the vagina is easy. Whereas when it's anteriorly bent, pressure from above will try to tend to raise up the cervix, which will prevent the prolapse. So mechanically, the facial supports support the cervix, muscular supports support the vagina, and the false supports of the peritoneal cover surrounding the uterus anteriorly posteriorly. If you pass a finger through pervaginal examination and proceed laterally, you will feel the ischial spine. Just above the ischial spine, if you inject an anesthetic agent, that will cause a pudendal nerve block. Pudendal nerve is supplying the somatic structures of the perineum. If you block the pudendal nerve, it can result in painless labor. So the painless labor is given by pudendal nerve block. Point to be remembered is that the abdominal muscles and the pelvic floor muscles are not paralyzed by pudendal nerve because they are supplied by sacral plexus in the abdomen. And the abdominal wall is supplied by lumbar plexus. So the contraction will not affect, but only the pain of the baby's head passing out to the vaginal opening will be decreased. So painless labor is the reason why one often does pudendal nerve block. We can also do another alternative is caudal anesthesia. The sacral hiatus, the needle is passed initially more horizontally, then it is bent and passed more or less vertically, and then the injection is given. That will cause the sacral fiber, terminal sacral fibers to get blocked. That's called caudal anesthesia. in contrast to lumbar puncture, which causes the lumbar anesthesia. Here, again, one of the reasons why we do caudal anesthesia is to have painless labor. Just behind the vaginal opening, in front of the anal opening, there is a perineal body. Perineal body is for the integrity of the muscles which are supporting the uterus. So what you do, instead of the baby's head coming out and tearing through the vaginal opening irregularly, you take a surgical incision, often posterolateral, not midline. Midline episode is nowadays not done. It was done earlier because it decreased the bleeding. But then if there is a vertical split, if it goes a little beyond midline, then it can also damage the perineal body. The whole purpose of cutting through the vagina to avoid damage to the perineal body would be lost in a midline episode. So mediolateral episiotomy is often done. This will cause the surgical incision on the posterolateral wall of vagina. It should facilitate the child's head from emerging. This is usually done in the first childbirth, but often repeated in the second childbirth. After multiple childbirths, there is no requirement for episiotomy. So then the baby's head, the vagina is accommodating of the baby's head. It's not really a This is done when the baby's head is bulging at the vaginal opening. Then you don't do a mediolateral episode. After the baby is delivered, you have to suture this back. So you are cutting through the skin, the vaginal epithelium, subcutaneous fat, the bulbospongiosus muscle, which is around the vagina, and the superficial and deep transverse muscle. This is a deliberate cutting so that after it is sutured, it will heal back. At least the perineal body is not damaged with episiotomy, because that will result in uterine prolapse at a later age when the facial supports have lost their tone. Tubectomy, a surgical method of blocking the fallopian tube, vasectomy, which is easier, which is difficult. Tubectomy is an intra-abdominal surgery. Vasectomy is the superficial surgery. So vasectomy is easier to perform. Tubectomy requires intra-abdominal approach. Reversal of tubectomy is much difficult. Reversal of vasectomy is simpler. Now, reversal of tubectomy is difficult. Reversal of vasectomy is almost impossible. Punctuate the sentence. Fun, fun, fun. Worry, worry, worry. It is fun, period, fun, period, fun, no period, and cause worry, worry. Infertility versus sterility. When you deliberately operate upon the fallopian tube and vas, it is called as a surgical operation for sterility. Infertility is where the person has hopes, wants a child, but is unable to conceive. So tubectomy is difficult, vasectomy easy. Tubectomy, difficult reversal, vasectomy, even more difficult reversal. So relatively easy reversal is tubectomy. With that, we come to the end of the discussion. If you have any questions, you can ask now.